First of all, thank you all for attending. I think at the outset, it's probably particularly important for us to reflect on the fact that as elected and appointed officials in local government throughout the state of Alaska, each of us has prospered on lands that were not just occupied, but protected by Alaska's original people since time immemorial. We live in an era that more readily, I think, reveals both these ancient and contemporary kind of connections between the land and the people, both covering the range of human activity, whether we're talking, just checking here for a sec, talking about family hierarchy, language, the arts, to conservation, enterprise, and governance. Our communities are all enriched by our enhanced understanding of and respect for these connections. And today we express our profound appreciation to be guests on the traditional lands and of the Dena'ina people. With that, our format today will be initially presentations from our panelists, and followed by some Q&A on my part, and ultimately, if time allows, lots of time for your questions to the panelists. Let me briefly introduce the people who are presenting today. You'll find online Terry Sloan and Don Begay, who are participating long distance from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Terry is the Intertribal Government Coordinator, and Don is the Native American Affairs Coordinator for the City of Albuquerque. And then on my extreme left, your right, is the Mayor of Sitka, Steve Eisenbeis. Next to him is Christopher Constance, Vice Chair of the Anchorage Municipal Assembly. And then to my immediate right, on the left, Dennis Robinson, who is the Vice Mayor for the City of Unalaska, and Papalangan Tribal Council board member. And finally, on my far right is Megan Sigvana Topkok, who is a member of the Nome Common Council and is a staff attorney for Coeric Inc. in Nome. With that, I'm going to perhaps give a little more detailed background on both Terry and Don. Don is a member of the Navajo Nation, and as the Native American Affairs Coordinator for the City of Albuquerque, her title is the Office of Equity and Inclusion. She's worked in homeless outreach at the First Nations Community Health Source and with the New Mexico Council for Racial Justice. She is a 2011 graduate of the University of New Mexico. Terry Sloan is a member of the Navajo and Hopi peoples, and is the intergovernmental tribal liaison who works with 5 tribes immediately surrounding Albuquerque, and in fact with the 23 tribes that are active in New Mexico. Terry is also the manager and supervising senior auditor for Sloan and Company. He's the director of the nonprofit organization Southwest Native Cultures, and is at this moment becoming an accredited member of the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, the non-governmental organizations branch. He has worked extensively on environmental issues on behalf of Native American tribes and has a degree of accounting. from the University of New Mexico. And with that, hoping we can turn now to the great state of New Mexico.
Great, thank you. My name is Dawn Begay. I'm the Native American Affairs Coordinator with the City of Albuquerque. As mentioned, I am Dene of the Navajo Nation. I am Lokatane Nechne, Hashkana Zawe, Bashichin, Trampahe Dashiche, Do Toneglini Dashanele. Those are my clans from my people, and I was born here in Albuquerque, but I grew up on the Navajo Reservation. And I'll kind of let Terry introduce himself as well.
Good afternoon, everybody, and it is an honor and my pleasure to present to you today. And thank you for that kind introduction, Niles. And I am a current member of the United Nations, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs since 2011. I am Dene and Hopi, Native American. I am born of the Kiani and born for the Itoatlini. Been a lifelong resident of the city of Albuquerque. I'm born in Shiprock, New Mexico. And I am the director of my NGO, South State of Cultures. As Niles mentioned, I'm a manager with our family accounting firm, Sloan and Company, and I'm the city's intergovernmental tribal liaison. And I hope we have a great presentation for you guys today. I know we do, and you'll find it very interesting. Dawn is a great ambassador for the city also. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with everybody. Okay. So as mentioned, we are from the City of Albuquerque, and today we're going to do a presentation over some of the efforts to establish our government-to-government relationship with Native American tribes. So before we begin, I wanted to give some of the composition, get rid of this, of New Mexico. So New Mexico itself has 23 Pueblos, tribes, and nations, 19 Pueblos, 3 Apache tribes, and the Navajo Nation. So you can see here for New Mexico, and the majority of the tribes and Pueblos are in the northwestern area. American Indians and Alaskan Natives alone or in combination with one or more races make up approximately 12.5% of the total state's population. And there's other tribal entities, including the All Pueblo Council of Governors, the 5 Sandoval Indian Pueblos, 8 Northern Indian Council, and the 10 Southern Pueblo Governors Council. The state of New Mexico itself has an Indian Affairs Department, and they are charged with implementing the New Mexico State Tribal Collaboration Act, which requires state agencies to develop policies, designate tribal liaisons in every state, provide cultural competency trainings, and report on state agency accomplishments. As we funnel down into Albuquerque, Albuquerque is the largest city in New Mexico, and it also has the largest urban Indian population in the nation, 7th largest, and it makes up American Indians and Alaskan Natives alone or in combination with one or more races make up approximately 8.3% of the total population. And here's a breakdown of our tribal affiliation with most ancestry for Navajo and Pueblo. So outlined in black are Albuquerque city limits, and immediately to the south we have the Isleta Pueblo, and to the north we have Sandia, Santa Ana, Zia, San Felipe, Santo Domingo, and then immediately to the west we have Cañoncito, which is a chapter of the Navajo Nation, and they now go by to Tohajale chapter. And we also have the Pueblo of Laguna, whose boundaries also extend very close to the city's boundaries. Also within the city itself is the All Pueblo Council of Governors main office. So what are some of the events that shaped Indian affairs or Native American affairs? In the early 1990s, there was an installation of the La Janada art piece using city funds. And this was a controversial piece because it includes Onate, who was one of the conquistadors that committed very violent crimes against the Pueblo people here. And the compromise the city made with the native population here was that they were going to create the initial Commission on Indian Affairs to serve as an advocate to help prevent any type of conflicts like this from happening in the future. In the early 2014, Allison Gorman and Key Thompson were two unsheltered Navajo men who were brutally murdered in their sleep. And this prompted tribal government, tribal leaders, community-based organization, and members of the public. They really had an outcry and demanded that the city do something to address the violence against Native peoples in Albuquerque. And what the city ended up doing was create the Native American Homelessness Task Force. And they met for over a year to create recommendations. And one of the main recommendations was to appoint a tribal liaison. And so I was brought in at that point to kind of serve 1 day a week as a tribal liaison. But also under our current mayor, Mayor Keller, he established the Office of Equity and Inclusion, which also includes the Office of Native American Affairs, and that allowed us to expand our staff to a full-time permanent Native American Affairs liaison, a part-time intergovernmental tribal liaison, and then to also have our Native American homelessness liaison. And that is the current structure of our department right now. So there are some city agreements and policies that are very key. In 2019, Mayor Keller became, the city of Albuquerque became the first city to recognize tribal sovereignty by signing a bill amending the Commission on American Indian Affairs ordinance. The amendment allowed the commission, or continues to allow the commission, to serve as the forum for government-to-government relations between the city and tribal nations, and advocates for Native Americans within and around the Albuquerque metropolitan area. It increased the size of the commission from 5 to 15 members and includes 6 tribal representatives from the Sandia Pueblo, Isleta Pueblo, Santa Ana Pueblo, Laguna Pueblo, and the Tohadjale chapter of the Navajo Nation, as well as the All Pueblo Council of Governors. So the tribal representatives are chosen not by the city, but by the chapter of Pueblo or council that they represent. And at the time, Mayor Keller said that we are proud to recognize and honor our surrounding sovereign tribes as true government-to-government partners. These are Albuquerque's neighbors to the north, south, and west. Our relationships impact public safety, employment, health, homelessness, and quality of life for all people. Now, for the first time, the laws on our books reflect our respect for that sovereignty and the importance of those government-to-government relationships. And so this was the first time that in a city policy, it actually recognized and requires the city to have a government-to-government relationship with the tribal nations. After that, additional agreements and policies that were made were an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding between the Navajo Nation and the City of Albuquerque. This was specifically for the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission and the City of Albuquerque's Office of Civil Rights, which attempts to strengthen communication between the Navajo Nation and the City of Albuquerque and addresses race relations, discriminatory actions against Navajo citizens and other culturally diverse populations. And just this year, City Council passed Resolution 21205, which was also signed by Mayor Keller on Indigenous Peoples Day. The resolution acknowledges and recognizes the Albuquerque Indian School at the City of Albuquerque's 4-H Park as a historical and sacred burial site. It acknowledges the historical and ongoing intergenerational trauma experienced by Native American individuals, families, and tribal nations, and commits the city to working with tribal nations and Native Americans towards reconciliation and healing. Other tribal initiatives, city tribal initiatives that are happening right now is we are still continuing to implement recommendations set forth by the Native American Homelessness Task Force. We are working with both the State Indian Affairs Department and tribes all across the state on the COVID-19 emergency response. We are developing our Native American language access to include Indigenous languages, mostly Navajo, Diné, and Cajaris language. The Albuquerque Police Department is now convening with the tribal chiefs of police to focus in on law enforcement issues, concerns, and needs. And we are really working at a state, tribal, and city level to focus on missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives, and also looking at access to sacred sites here in the city, as well as proposing recommendations and initiatives on how to do housing justice or how to provide housing stability for Native Americans here. And we're considering on whether or not we're able to stack capital resources, both local, state, and tribal to do to use for housing development here within the city. So these are some of the things that our office is working on. And so I'll go ahead and pass it on to Terry so he can kind of go on to like what's next. What are some of those things that we can look at?
Thank you, Don. First, I also like to acknowledge that today we present to you from the traditional ancestral lands of the Teotihuacan people, who were the original caretakers of the land that Albuquerque now resides on. What Albuquerque has done is through our previous and current mayor developed a heartfelt understanding of the need to develop and foster relationships with our local Native American tribes. As you have heard, it was sometimes done in response to unfortunate situations, which did reflect a recognition of and a listening ear to effectively respond as needed and in a proper way that helped the city build and grow to where we are now. In addition, the changing, growing, and aware state of the Native American tribes in New Mexico, and particularly the city's neighbor tribes, began to take their place in state and local political influence and economic growth, and feeling their untapped power and influence. Through self-determination and tribal sovereignty, the tribes begun to realize whom they really are, separate sovereign entities or governments existing within the southwestern part of the North America. The tribes became more organized, more self-sufficient, and self-aware of who they are. The power that the tribes held and could yield was beginning to be understood, and we're becoming a force to be reckoned with. Understanding this, Mayor Keller took the Albuquerque Commission on American Indian and Alaska Native Affairs and added a seat for the local tribes, which included the Pueblo of Laguna, Isleta, Pueblo of Laguna, the Toaje Navajo chapter, the Pueblo of Sandia, and the Pueblo of Santa Ana. He also created the Office of Equity and Inclusion, as Don had mentioned, where then he created the Office of Native American Affairs, hired the Office of Native American Affairs Coordinator, which is Don, and then subsequently the city's Intergovernmental Tribal Liaison, who is myself. The OEI was created in part to assess the imbalance of people of color's input, city employment, participation in vendor services to the city, and overall voice within and outside the city government culture and operations. Again, this led up to an understanding by the city of the need to further develop and enhance the government-to-government relationships with our local neighbor tribes. Under the charge of the Intergovernmental Tribal Liaison, the city's relationship to the remaining 18 tribes of New Mexico was also initiated. One aspect myself, the Intergovernmental Tribal Liaison, initiated as part of the development of adequate and sincere government-to-government relations was the development of a meaningful tribal consultation policy. This is a key process for enhancing and working with tribal nations. In addition, the Intergovernmental Tribal Liaison, myself, brought to the table the overarching Indigenous peoples' rights from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP. In September 2014, the United Nations held the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, where the General Assembly mandated to all 193 member states or countries that they begin implementation of the UNDRIP to its Indigenous peoples. And here in Albuquerque in September or November 2019, Mayor Keller officially recognized the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples for the Native American and Indigenous peoples of Albuquerque. One underlying doctrine for enhanced tribal sovereignty and self-determination and Indigenous peoples that arose from the UNDRIP was the doctrine of free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC. This brought to the table that Indigenous nations must be apprised of any proposed programs, construction, legislation, ordinances, laws, regulations, etc., that may or will have an effect on Indigenous nations' lands, government, or their people, that they be informed, consulted, and provided free, prior, and informed consent and input before any actions are taken that may affect them. The FPIC doctrine is now practiced by Indigenous peoples and nations and countries worldwide. Overall, in my opinion, this is a natural progression of government-to-government relations between tribal nations, townships, cities, and municipalities. If we are to work for the people and take to heart their well-being, health, progress, economic growth, wealth accumulation, then governments must work together to create that well-being that constituents and their communities so desire. Tribal nations bring so much to the table with their culture, music, food, science, medical, and natural, and ways of sustainability in working with the land or Mother Earth, with agriculture, environmental sensitivity, sustainable development, and a genetic sense of tending for our planet. We are still here after thousands of years in the North American continent. As governments, we must learn to coexist in harmony, brotherhood, and sisterhood, learn how to promote our strengths and mitigate our weaknesses, and become one in community, friendship, and partnership together. Only together can we look to secure our future for the 7 generations to come. Thank you.
And so this was just a very introductory, brief information on the work that we're doing. We're more than welcome to share this information or to provide more in-depth into each of these events. So here is our contact information, and I've included as many of the links on the slide as possible that'll take you directly to like further in depth. I thank you for giving us this time and sharing our information, and I really hope the best for everybody. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you both, Don and Terry, for your presentations. We'll have a chance to come back, I hope, with some questions for you as well as we go through. I'm going to move us through the state by starting to the west and then working our way east and south. So I'm going to begin next with Megan Sigvana Topcock of the Common Council of Nome. Sig is, as I mentioned earlier, the staff attorney for Coeric Inc. Many of you will know that Coeric is a consortium of some 20 tribes in the region, or 20 communities. She is responsible for working on issues related to tribal elections, the state child welfare cases, tribal courts generally, law enforcement, and personnel matters. In addition to her work at Coeric, Sigvana has served and currently is the president of the Nome, the Bering Sea Women's Group Board. She's a volunteer with the Nome Reentry Coalition and the Nome Youth Court Program. She's an adjunct professor at UAF's Northwest Campus, where she teaches courses on tribal governance, Alaska Native Studies, and the Inupiaq language. She's originally from Mary's Igloo on the Seward Peninsula. She's a 2017 graduate of the University of Oregon School of Law and a 2013 graduate of Dartmouth College with a BA in Native American Studies and Linguistics.
Koyana makes me sound a lot better than I am. So I just want to talk a little bit about what I've seen in terms of tribal municipal partnerships within the Bering Strait region. So a big reason that I chose to run for city council is I wasn't seeing Alaska Native people represented on our council, despite being a community that's about half and half Native, non-Native. So I think, you know, this panel in particular is really valuable, especially for those who are from rural hubs or from urban areas where you may have mixed populations and also have tribal governments within your area. So I'm just curious, how many of you are in a community where you know what tribe or tribes are located there? Awesome, Yoy. How many of you partner with your tribal governments? Oh, hey, this is awesome. Exciting. You guys should be up here. I shouldn't be here. So that was a big reason why I ran, is I wanted to see people who look like me, who had values like me, sitting in those roles, making decisions and influencing the policies that were put in place by the city. So, you know, and this can be a lot of different ways. It can be little things like bringing in our languages. So our poor clerk has to deal with me iperacking every so often and using impact terms. And when we do roll call votes, I'll go EE or Nome. And he has to translate it on the spot there. We did actually do welcome mats, I think, that said Pakaliripsi to put it out, just to try to create a more welcoming space. Because when you think about it, historically, Alaska Native people were often disenfranchised from these institutions. So you think about Nome being founded in 1901, that was a point in time where Alaska Native peoples had a really hard time becoming citizens within our own homeland. So we've lived on these lands for thousands of years, for millennia, we've taken care of these lands. But because of colonization, we haven't always had a role or a space within these institutions. So 1901, at that point, you had to have 5 white people sponsor you for citizenship. You had to have white people attest that you had given up your culture, you'd given up your family ties, your language, everything in order to become an Alaska citizen. Until 1924, when across the board, Native American people were granted citizenship by the federal government. So understanding these histories is really critical. And that's going to inform the way that you engage with your tribal governments. So I think a lot of us, we want to reach out and we want to work together, but sometimes there's tensions there, right? Sometimes there's historical reasons that people may not have gotten along or may feel like they don't have a place in these governmental entities. So what I really appreciate is, and again, a lot of my work is as co-work staff attorney, so I facilitate relationships between the municipalities and our tribal governments, because a lot of times tribes have access to different funding. We can partner together and leverage that for our respective citizens. So you think about Alaska Native people, we're multi-citizens, we're citizens of our tribal nations, we're citizens of our municipalities, of the state, of the federal government. So we have a lot of different hats that we end up wearing, and we all have access to different opportunities. And so finding ways to work together to mesh those opportunities can be really critical. And I've seen that during COVID as well, where the tribes have access to CARES funding, the municipalities have access to CARES funding, the corporations even, and they're able to come together and strategize. How is the best way to support our community in getting through this crisis that's impacting us all, which I think is just really incredible. The other thing that I really appreciated is we have, since I've come on board, we've had a youth rep, and because over 80% of our school district is Alaska Native, all 3 of our youth reps to date have been Alaska Native, who have been very passionate about finding ways to bridge those relationships between our Alaska Native community and the city. So recognizing Indigenous Peoples Day, bringing our languages in, talking about racial equity and historic trauma and how that's impacted. One really great, I guess, opportunity that we've had recently is to come together around housing and homelessness in our community. So many of the visible homelessness that we see in our community is our Alaska Native folks. And that's for a wide variety of reasons. And if anybody went to the presentation yesterday, was really fantastic. We know that there's a lot of different reasons that people end up not having homes. And so bringing together our different partners and stakeholders, our tribes, our tribal organizations, you know, there's so many different entities that are providing services. You have the tribes, you also have the nonprofits, you also have the for-profits who can come together and again, leverage funding, leverage resources, get creative with how to respond to situations like this. I'm sorry, how much time do we have? I don't want to take up all the time because I know we have a bunch of other people on the panel and I can pass it off if I need to. Okay. I also just, I guess before I pass it off, want to really put in a plug. If you're an Indigenous municipal elected official, appointed official, or staff member, there is through the National League of Cities an Indigenous Municipal Officials Working Group. So we have been meeting on a monthly basis. I think we're switching to every other month. So if anybody's interested, please find me and I'm happy to share that information. Kirk Reynolds has been kind of facilitating it on NLC's end, and it's just a really great way for us to come together with other Indigenous elected officials and share ideas. Because a lot of times I feel a little bit overwhelmed. I'm the only Alaska Native on my council. I don't always know what might work and what might not work. And so this is kind of a way to talk with like-minded folks about how we can support all of our citizens. So if anybody's interested, again, please find me. I'm happy to talk about it. We would love to plug more people in. And I know there's a lot of Indigenous elected officials out there. I mean, you think about our villages, we have 200 some villages. A lot of those are going to be Alaska Native, strong Alaska Native representation. So I would love to coordinate with folks to come together around that. And it's made up of folks from all across the nation. So we have people from Southwest, from the East Coast, who all come together and share what their communities have been doing. So it's really awesome. And it gives me a lot of hope for the future. But I know I've been talking for a little bit, so I will pass this off.
Yeah. Our next speaker is Dennis Robinson from Unalaska. Dennis has been in local government for decades. He was first elected to the city council in 1986 when he was 27. Actually, I think you must have been younger, but Dennis has served several times on the city council. Most recently was reelected in 2018 and currently holds the position of deputy mayor. He works as an independent business owner with interests in fishing, shipping, and oil support services industries. He's a former member of the Kawalangan tribe of Unalaska and the Unalaska Corporation, OC. Dennis.
Work. That one? There we go. Sorry. Thank you. Dennis Robinson. As introduced, I'm a former member of the Kawalangan tribe. Back in 1988, I gathered a group of 5 of us to rewrite our constitution and get federally recognized as the laws in Congress that passed through Congress in 1953 disbanded, was aimed to disband tribes across the nation. We happened to be one of those that got disbanded. So anyway, we got together, wrote a constitution, and in 1988 got that through Congress successfully. And probably the best part of that whole thing was that 22 other tribes utilized our constitution as a model to gain federal recognition in '93. So it was kind of a good milestone. I recognized way back then that the importance of working with municipalities and village corporations. In Unalaska, too hot. In Alaska, we have a kind of a unique situation where our village corporation owns nearly all of the land around us. There's a very small segment of land that's owned privately, and recognizing that is an entity that's going to have to, we're all going to have to work together in order to build our community, of which over the years we have, but it was up, and I tried getting all three together from, it took me 33 years of egging on, but we finally came up with a trilateral agreement between the tribe, the city, and OC to work together on for an IRT, or an innovative readiness training program that's through the Department of Defense, of which, if they can come in and do an assessment in your community as to what your needs are. It's a very utilized program that the Department of Defense has. I think it's Old Harbor that utilized that program to have them build the runway for them. It's they don't provide the money, but they will provide the labor to do so if you follow through and basically meet all the requirements for them to be able to do that. We signed this agreement last year in the end of August for the city and tribe to work with this IRT or with OC. And since extended it to continue on working to that same goal. Some of the things that we're focusing on is the feasibility of putting a military base or at least creating a military presence on the island of Unalaska. It just so happened that when we had the meeting with the IRT group in Unalaska, we had a number of our fishing vessels that were fishing up within our EEZ got interrupted by the Russian Navy, and were told to move out of the way of these Russian maneuvers in our EEZ, which I think is kind of was the impetus for seeing about quite possibly a military presence there in the Aleutians. Something closer to. I mean, we're pretty important. We're strategically important. Some of the other things that we were working on is, as an Arctic port, we're already built. We have everything that's needed. And minus some housing. So, but the importance of tribes, municipalities, and corporations or village corporations and regional, if they work in your area. Is that the tribes have opportunities for money that municipalities don't, and vice versa. There's each individual group has something to bring to the table, and we all know that with the state, the fiscal outlook is not very bright, but federally there's a tremendous amount of money available to tribes, and all you have to do is search it out and apply for it and follow through. I was an alternate board member, up until last year on it was the Indian Country Energy and Infrastructure Working Group, ICWIG, and we were successful in finally getting more money allocated to ICWIG from the federal government through the Department of Energy. But there's USDA, there's ICWIG, there's a number of entities within the federal government that provide a tremendous amount of money to tribes. So, I mean, I think, I recognize that early on, and that's what I continue to try to strive for. I would like to do similar to what Anchorage has done, and you will hear that coming up as far as recognizing our tribe, and codifying the agreement, the trilateral agreement, and getting it into law. So it, is something that we're forced to look at day in and day out. I think I'll leave it at there. Thanks.
Again, thanks very much, Dennis. Moving now towards the east, I turn to Christopher Constance of the municipality of Anchorage. Christopher was first elected to the Municipal Assembly in Anchorage in 2017, representing downtown Anchorage. She's serving right now as the vice chair of the Assembly. He's a licensed real estate agent as well as a grants and contracts director for a statewide nonprofit that focuses on substance abuse and behavioral health treatment. He previously served twice as the president of the Fairview Community Council. Christopher.
Thank you and good morning, everybody. Welcome to Anchorage. I was born in California, a city called Santa Maria on the lands of the Chumash people, and moved to Alaska 25 years ago. Spent half of my life here. First, I would like to acknowledge that we're on Eklutna land. And the only thing that isn't here today, or person that isn't here today who I wish was for this conversation, is Mr. Aaron Leggett, who is the tribal leader for the native village of Eklutna, who was a strong partner in the work that we have accomplished to date and the work that we are just beginning for the future. Second, I would like to thank the North Star Group and Veronica Slager and Carl Oles, who were strong partners in ensuring that the process that the assembly followed was able to be unanimously approved by the membership. On January 14th, 2021, Anchorage Ordinance 2020-137S was passed. When that proposal was first presented to the body, it was intended to recognize the sovereign village of Eklutna. And through the process of many meetings and much time and much outreach, the ordinance changed somewhat to recognize all Alaska Native tribes as sovereign in our community. As most of the villages and tribes have some representation in Anchorage, it made it very clear through the process that we needed to broaden our aperture and recognize everybody and not just those whose land we now occupy. There's quite a bit of history that I learned in the process of meeting with Mr. Leggett and his team. First, he suggested that before 1918 and the pandemic of the Spanish flu, the people of the native village of Eklutna were the #1 most populous group of people living here. And after the flu, that was no longer the case. And I think that that's significant to our time today. World War II, of course, as you know, brought an influx of substantial populations, which changed the demographics of Alaska. In the 1940s, there was a dam put up on the Eklutna River, and that's significant because it stopped the salmon that were the food source and really is part of the spiritual history of the people of Eklutna. And then, of course, there's the history of the North Anchorage Land Agreement, which was a lawsuit that was settled when the government of Anchorage took advantage of the rights of the people of the village of Eklutna and the corporation Eklutna Inc. And the courts recognized that Anchorage had a responsibility to meet its obligations to the native people who live here and serve here. Throughout modern Alaska history, there have been steps made forward at the state level to recognize the traditional and sovereign peoples of Alaska. But yet, as most of you surely know, we're still waiting for the state to stand up and do the most basic thing, which is recognize the first people of this land. Governor Knowles created a process by which there were consultations and an MOU. Mayor Begich at the time in Anchorage created a memorandum of understanding with the native village of Eklutna and the tribe of Eklutna Inc. And then Mayor Sullivan of course, ended up in court because he wasn't able to recognize and honor the people. And then finally, moving forward, you had Mayor Berkowitz and Mayor Quinn Davidson, who stayed out of the way when the assembly said, we're going to recognize the first people, the Eklutna people. The conversation was, why not just let it be a memorandum of understanding? Why do you need to put this into the code? That was an interesting conversation. You had some people fiercely opposed to the idea of simply recognizing the sovereignty of the people who are actually sovereign of this land. It was so strange to watch the arguments, how the end of the world was going to come if we did this. So why did we do it? We passed this ordinance recognizing all of the sovereign tribes of Alaska. First, simply to recognize the sovereigns who exist in our state, and especially the one that exists in our city. Second, we wanted to create a methodological approach to having ongoing relationships, not just ad hoc when there's a problem, but in an ongoing manner so that we could have what you would all recognize as relations. When I have a question, I call you. When you have a question, you call me. And we talk about where we are similar and want to work together. And as you've heard, who has the resources, who has the needs, and how can we work together to make sure the resources meet the needs. One thing for me was this conversation about the North Anchorage Land Agreement, which was a lawsuit that the municipality lost over the rights of gas coming out of the landfill. Why in the world did we have to go to court to solve this problem? Why wasn't the work done in advance to make sure that there was a communication and ability to solve this problem before we ended up in court? One of the other reasons that we did it is because we hoped to inspire every community in the state of Alaska to stand up and follow us, to look at our ordinance and ask your local government, can you do this? Will you do this? Let's do this, and then do it. Ms. Silvana Topkok talked about NLC, National League of Cities. I serve as well on that group. I serve in a number of capacities with NLC, and they have been watching Anchorage and this work that we're doing. And I thank Albuquerque for leading because we follow in their footsteps. One of our hopes was also that we would inspire local governments across the country to follow our lead, because this is a simple thing to be done that creates only benefits. The things that we heard that were going to be problems in advance never materialized. Finally, I would just offer that I believe we are in a time of great renaissance of tribal recognition and self-determination across the land. And we in local government have a responsibility to move that forward. Finally, I'll say that on December the 9th from 3 to 5 p.m., we will be hosting the second government-to-government meeting with the native village of Eklutna. The details are yet to be finalized. These meetings are open, and we would like to have members of the public, members of communities across the state follow along our process so you can see what benefit may arise. We're early in the process. We don't have a long slate of projects yet that we're working on or a long history because, again, this item passed just this year. But we would like to see it deepen and hopefully last for the next 1,000 years. And as one final coda, the municipality of Anchorage, the assembly has, to my knowledge, never had an Alaska Native person serve. And if you know someone who lives in the downtown district, we have added a 12th seat to our assembly, and in the spring we'll be having an election. So there's definitely room if there's someone who's willing to stand. Why someone would be willing to stand in the age of COVID is another question. With that, I say thank you.
Thanks, Christopher. We turn last to our last panelist, Stephen Eisenbeis, mayor of the city and borough of Sitka. Stephen was elected Sitka's mayor in 2020. He previously served on the assembly between 2014 and 2020, including 3 years as deputy mayor. He is a certified EMT, has worked as a volunteer with the Sitka Fire Department, Search and Rescue, served on the Police and Fire Commission, the Gary Paxton Industrial Park Board, the Chamber of Commerce Board, and the Downtown Revitalization Group. He and his wife Ashley own Russell's, which is a long-established clothing and sporting goods store located in downtown Sitka. Stephen.
Thank you for that introduction. If I ever need someone to write a resume for me, I know where to look. So our local sovereign government is the Sitka Tribe of Alaska. Our municipality is extremely proud of our relationship with Sitka Tribe of Alaska. Back in 1998, a memorandum of understanding was written and signed between the two governments, indicating a desire to work together on areas of mutual concern, support, and indicated a desire of both governments to work together for political matters that would benefit the municipality. I don't know that it's the oldest, but it is one of the older memorandum of understandings with tribal governments in the state. We're very proud of having that. In order to help facilitate this government to government relationship, we do host biannual meetings with tribal council and our assembly. One meeting the tribe will host, and the next meeting the municipality will host. We sit down to dinner and have this meeting. I find that to be a very formal but informal meeting at the same time, when everyone can sit down to share a meal together. It allows for some very open and in-depth conversations, which I appreciate. Some of the topics that we've gone over in the past include tourism, subsistence fisheries, Native representation on our boards, commissions, and committees, budgets, and our legislative priorities. In addition to that, there are quarterly meetings between Sitka Tribe of Alaska and the city and borough of Sitka. Those quarterly meetings are generally at the director level. So our municipal administrator and their general manager get together on at least a quarterly basis. Biannually, the tribal chairperson and myself, the mayor, will get together and collaborate on any issues that we see coming up as well. I don't want to say that it was a first, but as soon as I was elected mayor, I found it to be very important that I served as our liaison to the Sitka Tribe of Alaska. So I've been attending those meetings and have found it to be very enlightening. I'm hoping that in the future, while it's not codified that the mayor will be that person, I hope that in the future the mayors continue to be the liaison to the Sitka Tribe. As well, we do offer up our staff to Sitka Tribe of Alaska for their council subcommittees. In the past, depending on the subject matter, the Public and Government Relations Director, Planning Director, and municipal engineers have all been instrumental in some of their subcommittees moving forward. A really important factor that came up this last year was CARES Act funding. I don't believe that our municipality could have gotten through all of the money on the deadline without our partnership with Sitka Tribe of Alaska. They proved to be absolutely instrumental in not only distribution of some of the funds, but making sure that the programs happened as well. They had a framework in place for many social services that the municipality did not. And we were able to get some of those social services up and running with extreme speed because they already had that framework in place. As well, our local Sitka Tribe of Alaska works with the state court and Sitka Police Department to establish a therapeutic court as an alternative method to dealing with the accused, that they may have an underlying alcohol or substance abuse cause. And so it's a diversionary type thing where, as opposed to the person being tried in court, they can go through the tribal court. And that has proven to be somewhat difficult at times, only because of state laws, but extremely beneficial to those who have gone through the program. One of the larger benefits that we see on a regular basis is our partnership on legislative priorities. If you have not partnered with your local tribes on this, I would strongly encourage it. We partner in both lobbying and on legislative visits to DC and Juneau. Oftentimes, the tribe will take our priorities and we will take theirs as well. And so we have two voices on each of those trips. They're generally a unified voice. We talk about both of our priorities beforehand, but when the tribe can show up in DC and say that this is Sitka as a whole's priority coming from two governments, it's a very, very strong voice. So I'd encourage you to utilize that with any of your local tribes if you are not. And I can't understate here the value the Sitka tribe brings to our community. Without them in our community, there would be a massive hole there. People in the past have viewed the Sitka tribe of Alaska working only for its tribal citizens. However, that is very, very far from the truth. Sitka tribe of Alaska's influence and reach is everywhere in the community. Their programs touch just about everyone in the community. The money trickles down, the effects are widespread. And I honestly do not know what we would do without having them in our community. They are very integral and a mainstay in our community. The last thing I want to say here, that our memorandum of understanding definitely relies on both parties to be open to talking and to have a two-way relationship here. Right now, I feel that our partnership is the strongest that it's been in the last 10 to 15 years, but that relies on a city council who wants to make that memorandum of understanding work, and it relies on a tribe that wants to make it work. If you have a general manager or an administrator or an assembly who's not open to talking and listening, it tends to fall flat. It's not as productive. So you have to have the want and the will from the people. And that's one thing I think that's extremely interesting about Anchorage is codified memorandum of understanding is it's not at will at that point. It's something that you must do, that you will do. So I think right now our relationship is very, very high. I've seen it at lower points in the past, but anything we can do to continue that high level of relationship would be amazing. So I'll leave it at that. If anyone has questions for the panel, I think we have a little bit of time left. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. We are cutting this session slightly short because of Senator Murkowski speaking at 10. So I'm going to deviate a little bit from maybe the earlier format. I'm going to do a general question to all the panelists, recognizing that we have a variety of experiences, sizes of the community, lengths of time in which there's been engagement between the local government, municipal government, and the respective tribes. What would your advice be, your counsel to a municipality who does not at this point have a relationship with its local tribal government? What steps would you suggest in terms of engaging, and what pitfalls would you suggest could be avoided? And again, I open this up to any of the panel members for any reaction. Christopher.
Thank you. And what I just heard from the mayor of Sitka reminds me, we did put it into our code. It is the law of this land that we recognize all of the tribes of Alaska. But we did not do this without the tribe. So I didn't mention, and I think it's important to mention, that the tribal council of the native village of Eklutna approved and adopted its own resolution that stated that they too are interested and party to this process. I can't imagine a worse thing to do than for a local government to come up and pass into their law a process that hasn't been adopted by the people they want to have a process with. So we were very careful not to be colonialist in our approach, but instead to be partners deeply with the tribe. And so I would offer that if the work is going to happen, make sure it's done closely with the tribes of your community, because for us, the idea is to have a deep and meaningful relationship with the entire tribe and all of its leadership, and then ultimately the people. And you can only do that when you're looking eye to each other. So that is my one thing that I would have added after hearing you speak, was make sure this is done in close partnership.
And I can definitely agree there. If people are looking at starting some sort of memorandum of understanding, I would strongly encourage you to make sure that the organization that you want to partner with, the tribe, wants that agreement. Don't force it upon them. And if you do go down that road, I think there's lots of framework in place. I believe our memorandum of understanding is online, available for anyone to look at. It could be reviewed at this point. It's a little bit older, but there's definitely frameworks out there. But make sure that the tribe wants the partnership before you go down that road.
Don and Terry, I can't see you over my shoulder, so I don't know if you have any comment you'd like to make.
Yeah, this is Terry. I would also suggest doing your homework. Study the tribe, study their culture, study their language, study their food, study their the way they dress, their etc. Because getting to know the tribe at that level will only enhance your ability to create a relationship with that tribal organized or that tribe itself. And I think that would be very important for you to develop that understanding, even learn the language if you can, talk to them in their language. I was in on several US consultations under President Biden earlier this year, where they were talking about the CARES Act and ARPA funding that was coming into the tribes. And in one particular consultation, some of the the US representatives from Commerce and Treasury were speaking to one of our Pueblo leaders here actually in New Mexico. And the way they were addressing them was very problematic to me. And so when I had a chance to speak to the representative from the US, I told them that they need to really think of our tribal leaders as heads of state, like the President of the United States, the President of Japan, etc. So they need to have that level of respect and honor that when they work with and speak with our tribal leaders. So I think that's also important to remember. Again, having a policy of meaningful tribal consultation will really help too to address and work with the tribes. What they did ask me is if I had a policy on meaningful tribal consultation, and it was something I had been working on. So I did create one for the City of Albuquerque, which I did share with the US agencies, Commerce, Treasury, SSA, Interior, VA, and SBA. And so they did receive a copy of that, and I'll send a copy to Secretary Holland to take a look at. So I think developing a policy at that level will really help in you getting pre-thoughts about working with the tribes and how to do that. And again, taking into account who they are will be very important. Thank you.
Don, did you want to add anything?
Hi, yes. So I didn't mention too much of it, but our Office of Equity and Inclusion really focuses on who are the most vulnerable, who are unserved or underserved. And a lot of our efforts are focused on community engagement. And a lot of times, a lot of decisions have been made without community. And I think this also includes tribal engagement as well, is a lot of decisions, assumptions have been made without tribal nations involvement. And so this is just a part of the history of being a government institution. And when you are going into agreements, there are going to be some degrees of conflict because there's just historical colonization and racism. And a lot of those structures still exist within our city governance. And so we really look at it is behavior over time. You know, that's kind of when we look at trust, is looking at behavior over time. So evaluating the cities as an institution, not as like individuals within this institution, but as a municipality or a governing body, what has been your behavior towards tribal nations over time? Because that's really how people are going to embrace and evaluate you. If all the decisions and everything that have been reflected are against or have caused harm or have either focused on erasure of Native history and culture and peoples, or have focused on making decisions without them or not being inclusive, then there's going to be that conflict. But take the time to kind of work through that and really demonstrate that the decisions over long periods of time are going to be different. That's how you build trust. That's usually the first step, is to show that huge piece and have mutual ownership over these decisions and mutual accountability. And then also hold each institution responsible. I know a lot of conversations happened about capital, and it's not really taking away resources from tribal nations, because tribal nations, while they do receive some funding, it's not an unlimited supply. So it really is about holding the federal government to its trust, responsibility, obligations, and developing mutual respectful relationships between different government entities, and then stacking and leveraging capital and really evaluating what is the purpose, who's going to benefit and who's going to be burdened, and what are the unintended harms that this may cause. So when you come into the conversation with these, having that political awareness lens, and then also having a racial equity lens and a social vulnerability lens will really help part of this. And don't forget to also include cultural considerations, because a lot of the decisions that have impacts don't take in other cultural pieces as well. So, and representation is really a key as well. As mentioned here, is looking at who is invited to these decisions and who is there. And how much of the community is going to be a part of it, including tribal nations. So those are just some of the basic considerations, and not a shameless plug, or maybe it is, but we have a lot of racial equity toolkits on our webpage that kind of help guide these conversations, or to at least have municipality programs, policies, funding procedures to really add that extra layer of consideration into every decision-making process, not just when you think tribes should be included.
Thank you very
Niles,
much, Don.
Niles, one more thing too, as I mentioned previously too, a key component will be free, prior, and informed consent. That creates that trust that Don is talking about, which is very important. So I think that is also an issue too that really should be considered in wanting to work with any tribe or nation from a city council's perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Sig or Dennis, do you have any observations or comments you'd like to make?
Just be humble.
That work together.
I'm going to use this. We have a couple more minutes left, and I think we have time to take one or two questions. But I do, before I open it up, want to echo Christopher's comment about the important role that North Star Group, Veronica and Carl Oles have played not only in putting this together, but in creating basically a library of resources for all of us in developing better municipal tribal relations. And no one else is doing that great work. And I want to acknowledge their great contribution to Alaska. With that, yes.
Chekliluku Koyayuguluchi Tamakchi Koyaluku Ayemelaka invite Agaluchi to presentation namun na Huinga Yupi ho Homer Hunter out City Council newly elected official City Council member from City of Scammon Bay, Kuyamchi Tamakchi. I am grateful to Alaska Municipal League for inviting